There is a sound that no soldier ever wants to hear. It is the cold, metallic zip of a black rubber body bag being closed. It is the sound of finality, the sound of an end. In May of 1968, at a forward operating base in Vietnam, a doctor was kneeling over a mess of bloody meat that used to be a human being. The body on the stretcher was destroyed. It had been shot, stabbed, and blown up. It was covered in dried blood, bayonet wounds, and shrapnel holes. The intestines were exposed. The eyes were caked shut with blood and dust. The doctor checked for a heartbeat. Nothing. He checked for breathing. Nothing. He shook his head, signed the death certificate, and signaled for the orderlies to zip up the bag. Just another casualty in a war that was consuming them by the thousands. But as the zipper began to close, sealing the darkness, the corpse did something impossible. He couldn't speak. His jaw was broken. He couldn't move his arms. They were shattered. He couldn't open his eyes. They were crusted shut with blood and dust. But he could do one thing. He gathered the last ounce of moisture in his dehydrated body, summoned a rage from the very bottom of his soul, and spat a mouthful of bloody saliva directly into the doctor's face. The doctor jumped back in horror. The corpse was alive. This is not a scene from a zombie movie. This is the reality of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez. This is the story of a man who fought a 6-hour battle with his intestines in his hands. A man who was shot, stabbed, and blown up 37 separate times. A man who defied medicine, defied the enemy, and defied death itself. This is the story of the toughest soldier to ever wear the uniform of the United States Army. To understand how a human being can survive 37 wounds, you have to understand what he was made of before the first bullet ever hit him. Roy Benavidez was forged in hardship. Born in 1935 in a small town in Texas, he was the son of a Mexican-American sharecropper and a Yaqui Indian mother. His blood was a mix of grit and warrior spirit. But life didn't give him a fighting chance, it gave him tragedy. By the time he was 7, both of his parents were dead to tuberculosis. He and his brother were passed around to relatives, eventually dropping out of school to work the fields, shining shoes, doing anything to survive. He was a half-breed in a segregated Texas, looked down upon, told he was nothing. He grew up fighting poverty, fighting racism, fighting just to eat. In 1955, looking for a way out, he joined the Army. Finally, he had a home. He found that the discipline and the physical demands suited him perfectly. He joined the Airborne, then the Special Forces. He became a Green Beret. He was one of the elite, but in 1965, during his first tour in Vietnam, it seemed his career was over. While on a patrol, he stepped on a landmine. The explosion didn't kill him, but it shattered his spine. He was paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors told him the news with clinical detachment. Sergeant Benavidez, you will never walk again. You will be discharged from the Army. For most men, that would be the end of the story. A tragic accident, a disability check, a life in a wheelchair. But Roy Benavidez was not most men. He refused to accept the diagnosis. At night, in the hospital ward, when the nurses weren't looking, he would drag his paralyzed body out of bed. He would crawl on his elbows to the wall. With tears of agony streaming down his face, he would try to stand. He would fall. He would drag himself up again. He would fall again. He did this every single night for a year, driven by a sheer, stubborn refusal to be broken. One morning, the doctors came in to sign his discharge papers. Roy Benavidez looked them in the eye, swung his legs out of bed, and stood up. Then he walked out of the hospital. He didn't just walk, he went back to the Special Forces training qualification. He passed. He returned to active duty. The man who was never supposed to walk again was going back to Vietnam. May 2nd, 1968. Loc Ninh, Vietnam, near the Cambodian border. It was supposed to be a quiet morning for Roy. He was off duty. He had just attended a church service and was sitting in the mess hall, still wearing his civilian clothes, ready to relax. Then the radio crackled to life. "Mayday! Mayday! We are taking heavy fire!" It was a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team. They had been dropped deep into the jungle to monitor enemy movements, but they had been dropped into a trap. They weren't facing a patrol. They had landed right in the middle of a North Vietnamese Army base camp. They were surrounded by an entire battalion, over 1,000 enemy soldiers. 3 helicopters had already tried to rescue them and had been shot to pieces, forced to turn back with wounded crews. The team on the ground was being slaughtered. They were whispering into the radio that they were dead men. Roy Benavidez listened to the panic on the radio. These were his friends. He didn't think. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't even grab his M16 rifle. He ran out to the flight line, jumped onto a waiting helicopter that was preparing for one last desperate attempt, and yelled at the pilot, "Go! Go!" He had no weapon. He had a Bowie knife on his belt and a medical bag in his hand. He was flying into a meat grinder armed with Band-Aids and a knife. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, the jungle exploded. The air was thick with green tracers from heavy machine guns. The pilot couldn't land. The fire was too intense. He hovered about 10 feet off the ground. Roy didn't hesitate. He made the sign of the cross and jumped. The moment his boots hit the mud, he was shot in the right leg. The bullet knocked him down, but he got up. He began to run the 75 yards towards the trapped team. As he ran, a hand grenade exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore into his head and face. He was blinded in one eye, blood pouring down his face. He kept running. He reached the team. It was a scene from a nightmare. 4 of the 12 men were already dead. The other 8 were all wounded, pinned down in a tight circle, running out of ammo. Roy took charge. He grabbed an AK-47 from a dead enemy soldier and began to return fire. He dragged the wounded men into a better defensive perimeter. He administered morphine, bandaged wounds, and shouted encouragement, his voice cutting through the roar of battle. He was a whirlwind of violence and mercy. He called in airstrikes, directing the jet fighters to drop napalm, danger close, so close that the heat singed their eyebrows. He knew it was the only way to push the enemy back. For the next few hours, Roy was the only thing keeping those men alive. He was shot again, this time in the thigh. He was hit by more shrapnel in the back, but he refused to stop moving. He was carrying men over his shoulder to the extraction helicopter, running back into the fire to get the next one, firing his stolen rifle with one hand while dragging a body with the other. Finally, a helicopter managed to land. Roy began to load the wounded. The chopper was taking heavy hits. Oil was spraying everywhere. Roy was pushing the last of the survivors on board when he realized that the team leader's body, carrying classified maps and codes, was still out in the open. He couldn't leave it. The enemy would get the intelligence. He ran back out into the open to retrieve the body. As he picked it up, he was shot in the stomach. The bullet exited his back. He fell, gasping for air, holding his intestines in. But he stood up again. He picked up the body. At that moment, the helicopter pilot was shot and killed. The chopper crashed to the ground. Now there was no escape. They were back to square one, but now they had a wrecked helicopter to defend. Roy pulled the wounded out of the burning wreckage. He organized them into a tight circle around the crash site. For the next few hours, the battle turned into a medieval brawl. The enemy charged in waves. Roy was fighting them off with whatever weapons he could find. At one point, an NVA soldier lunged out of the jungle and stabbed Roy with a bayonet. The blade went through his left arm. In a burst of primal adrenaline, Roy grabbed the bayonet with his bare hand, pulled it out of his own arm, pulled out his own Bowie knife, and killed the soldier in hand-to-hand combat. His jaw was broken by the butt of a rifle. He had been shot in the leg, the thigh, the stomach. He had shrapnel in his head, face, and back. He had been stabbed. He was losing blood at a catastrophic rate, but he was still moving. He was still fighting. He was checking on his men, distributing the last of the ammo. He was the physical embodiment of sheer will. Finally, after 6 hours of continuous combat, rescue helicopters broke through. Roy, barely conscious, helped load the survivors. He let everyone else go first. Only when the last living man was on board did he allow himself to be pulled into the chopper. As the helicopter lifted off, Roy Benavidez finally let go. His body shut down. He lay in a pool of his own blood, unresponsive. The door gunner looked at him and shook his head. This one's gone. When they landed at the base, the triage began. The doctors were overwhelmed. They saw Roy, a man with no pulse, no movement, eyes fixed and dilated, covered in terrible wounds. They moved him to the dead pile. And that brings us back to the moment with the body bag. The doctor was zipping him up. Roy couldn't move. He was locked inside a dying body. But his mind was screaming, "I am not dead! I am not dead!" He summoned that spit. It was his last act of defiance. The doctor froze. "He's alive!" he screamed. "Get him into surgery, now!" The surgery lasted for hours. It took months of agonizing rehabilitation for him to recover. He had to learn to walk again for the second time in his life. But he survived. You would think that a man who saved 8 lives and fought for 6 hours with 37 wounds would instantly be awarded the Medal of Honor. But Roy's story had one final twist. The Army proposed him for the Distinguished Service Cross, a lesser reward. Why? Because the witnesses were all dead or missing. To get the Medal of Honor, you need eyewitness testimony detailing the specific acts of valor, and everyone thought there were no survivors who saw exactly what Roy did. For 13 years, Roy lived quietly. He didn't brag. He raised his family. He suffered from constant pain. Then, in 1980, a man named Brian O'Connor was reading a newspaper article about Roy's case. O'Connor was the radio man from that team in Vietnam. He had been severely wounded and believed dead by many. He read the article and realized, I was there. I saw it all. O'Connor wrote a 10-page report detailing every second of Roy's heroism. He described how Roy had saved his life, how he had refused to die. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan stood in the courtyard of the White House. He read the citation. It took nearly 15 minutes just to list the injuries and the actions Roy performed that day. Reagan turned to the cameras and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it." Roy Benavidez stood there, stiff and proud in his uniform. He was older now. He walked with a limp, but he was alive. He accepted the medal not for himself, but for the men who didn't come home. Roy Benavidez passed away in 1998. He spent his post-war years traveling to schools, talking to young people about the importance of education and staying off drugs. He would tell them, education is the key to freedom. But his legacy is etched in the history of warfare. He is the benchmark. When soldiers talk about toughness, they talk about Roy Benavidez. When they talk about never quitting, they talk about the man who held his intestines in one hand and a rifle in the other. His story asks a question of every person who hears it. When you are beaten down, when you are hurt, when the odds are impossible and the world is closing in on you, do you let the zipper close, or do you spit in the face of death and keep fighting? Roy Benavidez taught us that as long as you have a breath in your lungs, you are still in the fight. He was the impossible soldier, the unkillable man, the true American hero.